Prepare to unravel the darkest layers of one of fiction's greatest sagas. Have you ever wondered what truly transforms a promising hero into a symbol of oppression? What if the key to understanding evil lies not just in the acts, but in the mind behind them? What you are about to discover might change your perception of the power of choices and the fragility of the human soul, revealing how fear and despair can shape a tragic destiny and the irreversible consequences of a path forged in darkness. Before becoming the imposing and feared figure we know, Darth Vader was Anakin Skywalker, a young man with extraordinary potential and an immense heart, but already scarred by a childhood of deprivation and suffering. His journey began on Tatooine, a desolate and hostile planet, where he lived as a slave alongside his mother, Shmi Skywalker. This environment of servitude, where freedom was a distant mirage and life a constant struggle for survival, was the first stage for the formation of his psyche. He dreamed of freeing his mother and himself, a noble desire that ironically would become one of the pillars of his downfall. The experience of being property, without control over his own destiny or his mother's, instilled in him a deep and lasting aversion to helplessness, a silent motor that would drive him in search of power, a way to never be vulnerable again. Upon being discovered by Qui-Gon Jinn, a perceptive Jedi Master who saw unprecedented potential in the Force, Anakin was taken to Coruscant, the center of the Galactic Republic, to be trained in the venerable Jedi Order. There, he found a new family, a support structure, and a purpose greater than his own existence. However, the Jedi Order, in its pursuit of balance, detachment, and rigid control of emotions, often failed to acknowledge and accommodate Anakin's deep emotional connections. His aversion to detachment, intensified by the excruciating pain of leaving his mother behind and her subsequent and devastating loss in his arms, began to shape a psychological vulnerability that would be his undoing. He craved control, a way to avoid the pain of loss that had already marked him so deeply, a trauma that refused to heal. This quest, though born from a place of care and love, made him susceptible to manipulation and promises of absolute power, a fertile ground for the seed of darkness. The political environment of the Republic, with its endemic corruption, paralyzing bureaucracy, and growing instability leading to an impending civil war, also contributed to Anakin's unease. He saw the inefficiency of the Senate, the slowness of decisions, and the apparent blindness of the Jedi to the imminent threats manifesting in the form of a separatist confederacy. All of this generated growing frustration, a sense that conventional solutions were insufficient to stem the tide of chaos that was approaching and threatening to sweep away everything he knew. The Jedi Order, with its rigid rules and apparent inaction in the face of the growing threat, seemed incapable of protecting the galaxy and, more importantly, the people he loved. The first psychological trait that emerged, and that would become a relentless driving force in his life, was his need for control, a visceral response to the helplessness experienced in childhood and the pain of loss. He no longer wanted to be a passive spectator in the face of adversity, unable to protect those dear to him. This need, in itself, was not intrinsically negative, but the way it would manifest, seeking shortcuts and drastic, extreme solutions, would be his Achilles heel, the weak point that would be mercilessly exploited by those who coveted his power. However, there was something no one saw coming, a shadow that would silently extend over the galaxy, transforming his savior into its worst nightmare. The true turning point in Anakin's journey was not a single, cataclysmic event, but rather a series of culminating moments that aligned to dismantle his emotional and moral structure, fragmenting his soul into pieces. The most potent trigger, what pushed him to the edge of the abyss, was the overwhelming fear of loss, a visceral dread intensified by disturbing visions of Senator Padma Amidala, his secret wife, facing a grim fate. He had already witnessed life's fragility with the passing of his mother, Shmi, in his arms, an experience that deeply scarred him, and the prospect of reliving that excruciating pain with Padme was simply unbearable, something he refused to accept, no matter the cost. This fear, expertly exploited by Chancellor Palpatine, a master of psychological manipulation and a Machiavellian strategist who saw in Anakin the perfect instrument for his plans, began to erode Anakin's faith in the methods of the Jedi Order. Palpatine, with his persuasive rhetoric, carefully chosen words, and promises of limitless power, perceived Anakin's vulnerability and knew how to plant the seeds of distrust and doubt in his mind, drawing him away from the light. He presented the dark side of the Force not as a path of evil and destruction, but as a source of absolute power, capable of preventing loss and pain, of even defying death and preserving the lives of those he loved. For Anakin, desperate to protect those he loved and haunted by his recurring nightmares, this promise became irresistible, the only hope amidst despair, a shadowy beacon in his personal storm. Anakin's internal conflict was overwhelming, a pitched battle between his light and his shadow, between what he knew was right and what his desperation compelled him to do. On one side, his loyalty to the Jedi Order, to his friends, to Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, and to the code he had sworn to follow. On the other, the desperation to save Padme at all costs, a need that seemed to override any doctrine, any oath, any moral principle. Externally, he felt increasingly isolated, sensing that the Jedi didn't understand him, didn't fully trust him, and were holding him back, preventing him from reaching his true potential, especially after his appointment to the Jedi Council with the restriction of Master, an insult to his perception of his own power and importance. Psychology would describe this transformation as a process of identity disintegration, where overwhelming pressure and external manipulation lead to the fragmentation of the self, diluting previously ingrained values and beliefs. Anakin, confronted with an impossible dilemma, began to rationalize his choices, distorting reality to justify his darkest and most brutal acts. The pursuit of power, initially motivated by love and protection, gradually became an end in itself, an obsession that consumed him. Cognitive dissonance set in. He knew, on some level, that he was acting against the principles he cherished, but the promise of saving Padme was his anchor, however illusory and dangerous it was, pulling him deeper into the abyss. And it was there, in that whirlwind of emotions and distorted choices, that everything began to crumble, paving the way for absolute darkness. With each step into the abyss, Anakin Skywalker's mind, now on the verge of becoming Darth Vader, began to reshape itself in a profound, complex, and terrifying way. The darkness was not a formless chaos, a senseless madness. It was, for him, a perverse and logical structure building within his mind, solidifying with each dark choice and each merciless act. Facts were reinterpreted through a new lens, distorted to fit his new narrative. The words of the Jedi Masters, once wise guides and counsel, now sounded like unbearable restrictions and limitations. His attitudes, once hesitant and conflicted, became increasingly decisive, ruthless, and brutal, demonstrating a growing acceptance of his new identity. To understand Anakin's new way of thinking, we need to take a courageous dive into his mind, a place where pain and fear transformed into rage, resentment, and a relentless determination to never be weak again. He began to see the world through the lens of a scarcity and threat mentality, where power was no longer a tool for the good of the galaxy, but an absolute necessity to survive and, crucially, protect what remained of his personal life, especially Padme. Palpatine's promise to save those he loved echoed in his thoughts like a mantra, an undeniable truth, distorting his perception of right and wrong, good and evil. The pain of loss was the fuel that fed his fury and his thirst for power, and the dark side, the only visible way out, the only hope of avoiding a repeat of the trauma that haunted him. We can draw an analogy with the theory of learned helplessness, a psychological concept where an individual who has experienced traumatic situations of lack of control over adverse events can develop an ingrained belief that nothing they do can change their destiny unless they acquire supreme power. Anakin, after losing his mother so brutally and fearing the imminent loss of Padme, felt helpless and trapped by the Force and circumstances. The solution offered by Palpatine, the unlimited power of the dark side, seemed to be the only way to regain that control and avoid future pain and loss, even if it meant bowing to darkness. He rationalized his brutal actions, such as the massacre of the Separatists and the young Padawans, as necessary to achieve a greater goal: the safety of his beloved and the imposition of a new galactic order. The suppression of empathic emotions and the growing acceptance of violence were clear symptoms of this new and dangerous way of thinking, where cruelty was justified by supposed necessity. With each act of cruelty, Vader's mind solidified, his new identity forged in the furnace of pain and the desperate pursuit of control. He convinced himself that compassion was a weakness that made him vulnerable, an emotion that needed to be eradicated, and that fear was the most effective tool to achieve his goals and maintain order. The true monster, still dormant within him, was about to awaken in all its fury and power, ready to consume the galaxy in its quest for absolute control. The point of no return for Anakin Skywalker was an act of transgression that would echo throughout the galaxy, a dark and indelible mark on his journey: the extermination of the young Padawans in the Jedi Temple. This moment was not merely an act of unspeakable cruelty and barbarism. It was the deliberate destruction of his very essence, his innocence, his ideals, and everything he represented as a Jedi. By raising his weapon against those who represented his old life, his hope, and the purity of the Force, he sealed his destiny and embraced the darkness completely, irreversibly, and without any immediate shadow of regret. His worldview radically changed, as if a dark and distorted lens had been permanently placed over his eyes, altering his entire perception of reality. Where he once saw hope, justice, and balance in the Jedi Order, he now saw hypocrisy, failure, and a chronic inability to act. Palpatine's twisted logic had deeply rooted itself in his mind, corroding any lingering goodness. The Jedi Order was a threat to the peace and security he craved, and therefore it had to be eliminated without mercy. Ethics and morality, once pillars of his existence and the Jedi Code, were subverted by a perverse rationalization that his actions were for the greater good, or, more precisely, for his own distorted and selfish version of it. He convinced himself that the Jedi Order had failed him, and that his only option was to assume total control, even if it meant becoming the galaxy's greatest oppressor, a relentless tyrant. Let's bring the viewer into a disturbing and agonizing dilemma that echoes in our own understanding of human behavior. What if in Anakin's mind this was the only way out? What if he truly believed, in his desperation and blindness, that he was doing what was necessary to prevent even greater suffering, to protect those he loved, even if that meant diving into darkness? The psychology of fanaticism and radicalization shows us how individuals can commit terrible and unthinkable acts when they believe, with an almost religious fervor and unwavering conviction, that they are acting for a just cause, even if that cause is completely distorted, malicious, and destructive. Anakin, in his blindness and despair, had convinced himself that he was a savior, the only one capable of bringing order to a chaotic galaxy, and not a merciless destroyer. His morality had been rewritten to adapt to his new reality, where the ends justified the darkest and cruelest means, where violence was the answer to everything. This act of transgression was not just an isolated event. It was the brutal confirmation that the Anakin we knew had disintegrated, giving way to a new and fearsome identity: Darth Vader. The disturbing question that remains is, how close to the point of no return can we be when we are driven to despair, manipulation, and the promise of unlimited power, And what are the consequences of crossing that line? Darth Vader's mind, though terrifying in its manifestation, operated with an internal logic that for him made perfect sense. It wasn't pure madness, a senseless delusion leading to random acts. It was a cold and methodical calculation, a systematization of despair and an insatiable desire for control, transforming him into a machine of oppression. Delving deeper into the psychological analysis, we can see how this logic was built and strengthened, becoming the foundation of his relentless tyranny. Vader operated under a distorted cognition where compassion was seen as weakness, a vulnerability that exposed him to pain and loss, and the imposition by force as the only effective and efficient way to achieve his goals and maintain order. His brutal acts, such as the shocking destruction of the planet Alderaan, were not random or impulsive. They were calculated demonstrations of power, designed to instill the deepest fear and ensure unquestioning obedience from everyone. He firmly believed that, by eliminating all opposition and imposing a rigid and implacable order through terror, he could prevent the chaos and pain that so haunted him and that he had experienced in his life. This belief, however perverse and destructive, was the backbone of his tyranny and his new identity as the Empire's enforcer. We can use studies on trauma and aggressive behavior to validate Vader's behavior, showing a sad correlation. Individuals who have experienced significant losses, profound traumas, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness can develop extreme defense mechanisms, including the relentless pursuit of power and the use of aggression as a form of control over their environment and others. The traumatic loss of his mother, the terrifying visions of Padma's imminent loss, and the feeling of powerlessness in the face of these events shaped his psyche irreversibly, transforming him. He became the aggressor, the oppressor, to never again be the victim, to never again feel the pain of loss and helplessness. Comparing him to other fictional characters or even real-life authoritarian leaders and historical figures, we see a disturbing and recurring pattern. Often, these individuals are driven by a deep sense of injustice, humiliation, or trauma, which leads them to seek absolute control as a way to avoid future pain or the repetition of traumatic experiences. They rationalize their actions, however cruel and inhumane, as necessary to achieve an order or security that seems unattainable by other means. Vader's coldness was not the total absence of emotion, but rather its calculated suppression, a shield so that emotions would not deter him from his dark purpose. He had become a control machine, driven by a relentless and destructive logic. It wasn't madness, a sudden irrationality. It was cold calculation, forged in the furnace of trauma, despair, and manipulation, resulting in a mind that saw destruction as the inevitable path to a distorted peace imposed by brute force, no matter the cost. What remains after the devastating passage of Darth Vader? The legacy of chaos he left behind shaped the galaxy for decades, a dense and oppressive shadow that stretched across every corner of the known universe. Worlds were oppressed, entire populations were subjugated by imperial force, lives were mercilessly extinguished, and hope seemed to have been crushed under the Empire's iron fist. His presence instilled palpable fear, an aura of terror that silenced any opposition and suffocated any glimmer of freedom, and the scars of his tyranny were visible in every corner of the galaxy, on every face marked by suffering and resignation. His actions, driven by a distorted desire for absolute protection and control, ironically led to the destruction of what he cherished most: family, love, true peace, and the very order he swore to uphold. The galaxy he intended to save under the Empire's aegis became a place of widespread suffering, oppression, and despair. The consequences of his choices affected not only the lives of billions of beings, but also his own soul, which remained in agony beneath the cold and impenetrable mask, a prisoner of his own decisions, tormented by the ghosts of his past. Let's bring in a deep philosophical and moral reflection that echoes through time. Who are we to judge the depths of pain that drive an individual to such extreme acts? The story of Anakin Vader confronts us with the intrinsic fragility of human nature and the frightening ease with which despair, fear, and the promise of power can be exploited and manipulated by dark forces. It questions us about the thin and dangerous line between the pursuit of security and tyranny, between protecting those we love and oppressing those who oppose us. It is a somber reminder that, however well-intentioned the initial impulses may be, the path to suffering and destruction can be paved by distorted choices and the relentless pursuit of absolute control. However, even in the deepest abyss of darkness, the spark of redemption can emerge, a glimmer of light amidst the darkest night, proving that not all is lost. Vader's legacy, paradoxically, also includes the seed of his own downfall and, finally, his ultimate redemption through the unconditional love and persistence of his son, Luke Skywalker. His death, though tragic in its outcome, was an act of sacrifice that brought a rare moment of balance to the Force and freed the galaxy from his yoke, ending a dark chapter. But perhaps he was not the last to tread this dangerous path, and the story of his fall serves as an eternal warning for future generations. The saga of Darth Vader leaves us with a disturbing reflection. Darkness often arises from the deepest pain and the most intense desire to protect what we love. He became the personification of fear that transformed into control, a hero who embraced tyranny in the distorted belief that he was saving the world. His story is not just an epic adventure, but a deep dive into human psychology, revealing how the pursuit of power, born of despair and manipulation, can lead to ruin and, paradoxically, to redemption. What would happen if your greatest passion became your greatest prison, and the consequences of that choice changed the galaxy forever?